I'm Eleanor.
I hope you weren't expecting someone else.
No, I wasn't expecting anyone like you at all.
Jacob Hart had spent 5 years building his ranch from nothing, and in all that time, he had never once questioned his plan. He would work until his hands bled, save until his pockets were full, and then he would find a wife, a quiet, obedient woman who would tend his home and bear his children and never ask him to be something he was not. He placed an ad in the matrimonial news, describing himself as a stable rancher seeking a bride of gentle temperament. He received dozens of replies. He chose Eleanor Walsh because her letter was short, practical, and promised nothing more than competence. The day she arrived, Jacob stood on the train platform in his best shirt, his hands clasped behind his back, his face composed. He expected a woman in a bonnet, with soft hands and a softer voice. He expected someone who would look at the ground when he spoke, who would follow him to the wagon without question, who would be grateful for the roof he was offering. The train pulled in, the doors opened, and the woman who stepped down was none of those things. Her boots were caked with mud, her dress was travel-stained, and her eyes, dark, fierce, unreadable, met his without flinching. "Mr. Hart?" Her voice was lower than he expected, rougher, as if it had been worn smooth by years of use. He nodded, unable to speak, and she stepped forward, extending her hand. He took it automatically, and her grip was firm, her palm calloused. This was not a woman who had spent her life embroidering by the fire. This was a woman who had worked, who had fought, who had survived things he could not imagine. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "I hope you weren't expecting someone else." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I wasn't expecting anyone like you at all." The ride to the ranch was silent. Jacob stole glances at her as they drove, trying to reconcile the woman beside him with the letters he had received. Her letters had been neat, practical, devoid of emotion. But this woman with her sharp cheekbones and her steady gaze and the small scar that ran across her left hand, was anything but practical. She caught him looking and did not look away. "You're wondering if I'm the same woman who wrote to you," she said. He flushed, embarrassed to be so easily read. "The thought crossed my mind." She smiled then, and it transformed her face. "I am, and I'm not." The ranch was modest but solid, a cabin Jacob had built with his own hands, a barn that had weathered 3 winters, a corral where his horses stood in the afternoon sun. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon before he could offer his hand, walked to the porch, and stood looking out at the valley. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice was softer now, almost wondering. Jacob came to stand beside her, his hands in his pockets, unsure what to do with a woman who did not wait for him to lead. "It's not much," he said. She turned to look at him, and her eyes held something he could not name. "It's everything." The first week was a battle of wills. Jacob had expected a woman who would cook his meals and keep his house and stay out of his way. Eleanor did all of those things, but she did them on her own terms. She rose before dawn, worked alongside him in the fields, and spoke her mind with a bluntness that left him speechless. She did not defer to him, did not ask for his permission, did not seem to care that he was supposed to be the one in charge. He told himself he was annoyed. He told himself he had made a mistake. But late at night, when the cabin was quiet and he could hear her breathing in the next room, he felt something he had never felt before: curiosity. The trouble came at the end of the second week. A gang of outlaws, men who had been terrorizing the territory for months, rode through the valley and saw the ranch. They saw a man alone, a woman alone, a place with no one to protect it. Their leader, a man named Cross, with a scar across his cheek and a smile that never reached his eyes, rode up to the porch and demanded food, water, and the woman. Jacob stepped in front of Eleanor, his hand on his rifle, his heart pounding. "You're not getting anything," he said. Cross laughed, and his men laughed with him. And then Eleanor stepped around Jacob and faced the outlaws herself. "You want me?" Her voice was calm, almost bored. "Then come and get me." Cross stopped laughing. His men stopped laughing. Jacob stood frozen, his hand still on his rifle, watching as Eleanor picked up an axe from the woodpile and rested it on her shoulder. She looked at the outlaws the way she might look at a problem that needed solving, without fear, without hesitation, without doubt. Cross stared at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. He had expected a frightened woman, a woman who would beg. He had not expected this. He touched his hat, turned his horse, and rode away. His men followed, and Jacob stood on the porch, staring at the woman he had married, seeing her for the first time. That night, they sat by the fire, and Jacob asked her the question that had been burning in his mind since she stepped off the train. "Who are you?" She was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her eyes on the flames. "My father was a trapper," she said finally. "He raised me in the mountains, taught me to hunt, to track, to fight. He died when I was 16, and I've been on my own ever since." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw the loneliness she had carried. The same loneliness he had carried since he came to this valley. "I answered your ad because I was tired of being alone," she said. "Not because I needed someone to take care of me." Jacob sat with her words, turning them over in his mind. He had spent 5 years building a life that required nothing from anyone. He had told himself he wanted a wife who would fit into that life, who would ask for nothing, who would be grateful for what he gave her. But sitting here, in the firelight, with a woman who had faced down a gang of outlaws with nothing but an axe, he realized that he had been wrong. He did not want a woman who would fit into his life. He wanted a woman who would stand beside him. "I don't want you to be different," he said, and the words surprised him even as he spoke them. "I want you to be exactly who you are." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Jacob's life. Not because Eleanor was difficult, she was not, but because she challenged everything he thought he knew about himself, about marriage, about the kind of man he wanted to be. She worked beside him in the fields, her strength matching his, her endurance outlasting his. She taught him to track, to hunt, to read the land in ways he had never learned. And at night, when the work was done and the fire was low, she told him stories about her father, about the mountains, about the life she had left behind. He found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in years. The drought came in the summer, a slow creeping death that turned the grass to dust and the creek to a trickle. Jacob watched his cattle weaken, his crops wither, his savings drain away. He had survived blizzards and floods and attacks from outlaws, but he did not know how to survive this. He sat on the porch at night, staring at the sky, waiting for rain that never came. Eleanor found him there, sat beside him, took his hand. "My father taught me something," she said. "He said that water is never really gone. It just goes where we can't see it." He looked at her, at the woman who had become his partner, his equal, his everything. "Do you know where to find it?" She smiled, and in her eyes, he saw the same fire that had faced down the outlaws. "I have an idea." She led him to a place he had never seen, a canyon hidden behind a ridge, a crack in the earth that opened into darkness. She had found it years ago, she said, on a hunting trip with her father. She had never told anyone about it because she had never trusted anyone enough. But she trusted him now. They climbed down into the canyon, their boots slipping on the rock, their hands scraping against the stone. And at the bottom, where the sun never reached, they found it. Water. A pool so clear it seemed to glow, fed by a spring that had been flowing for 1,000 years. Jacob knelt, cupped his hands, drank. It was cold, sweet, alive. He looked up at Eleanor, and his eyes were wet. "You saved us," he said. She shook her head. "We saved us." The news spread through the valley, and the neighbors who had once looked at Eleanor with suspicion now looked at her with awe. She had found water where no one else could. She had saved the ranches, the cattle, the lives that had been hanging by a thread. Jacob watched as she moved among the people, answering their questions. showing them the way to the canyon, asking nothing in return. She was not the woman he had ordered from a newspaper. She was something more. She was a leader, a healer, a woman who had been wild and fierce and alone, and had chosen to share her strength with all of them. That autumn, Cross and his men came back. They had not forgotten the woman with the axe, the man with the rifle, the ranch that had defied them. They came with more men this time, with guns drawn, with a thirst for revenge that had festered through the summer. Jacob saw them coming from the ridge, and his blood went cold. He ran to the cabin, grabbed his rifle, told Eleanor to hide. She looked at him, and for a moment, he saw the woman who had stepped off the train fierce, unbroken, unafraid. "I'm not hiding," she said. "Not from them. Not ever again." They fought together, side by side, as the outlaws rode down the valley. Jacob fired his rifle. Eleanor fired his pistol, and between them, they held the line. The outlaws were more numerous, better armed, but they had not counted on a woman who had been raised in the mountains, who had learned to fight before she could read, who had faced death 100 times and never flinched. When the smoke cleared, Cross lay dead in the dust, his men scattered, the ranch still standing. Jacob stood in the field, his hands shaking, his heart pounding, and watched Eleanor walk toward him through the smoke. She was bleeding from a cut on her arm, but she was smiling. "I told you," she said. "I don't hide." That night, after the neighbors had come and gone, after the wounds had been bandaged and the dead had been buried, Jacob sat with Eleanor on the porch. The stars were bright, the air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. He took her hand, his fingers finding hers, and for a long time, neither spoke. "I thought I wanted a quiet bride," he said finally. "Someone who would follow the rules, stay out of trouble, never surprise me." She looked at him, and in the moonlight, her face was softer, younger, more beautiful than he had ever seen it. And now? He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Now I want you, exactly as you are." They were married again in the spring, not because they needed to be, but because they wanted to celebrate the woman she had become and the man he had become beside her. The whole valley came, the neighbors who had once whispered about her now cheering her name, the children who had once been afraid of her now running at her feet. She wore a dress of white cotton, and in her hair, she wore a feather from an eagle she had hunted with her father years ago in a different life. Jacob stood beside her, his hand steady, his heart full, and when the preacher asked him if he would take this woman to be his wife, his voice did not waver. "I will," he said. "I have. I always will." The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. They built a life together, a ranch that grew from a small cabin to a spread that stretched across the valley. They had children, a daughter with Eleanor's fire and Jacob's stubbornness, a son with Jacob's patience and Eleanor's courage. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was low, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars appear, and she would tell him stories about her father, about the mountains, about the life she had left behind to come to him. He never tired of listening. He never stopped being grateful that she had stepped off that train, that she had been nothing like what he ordered, that she had broken every rule he had ever made. On the night of their 10th anniversary, Jacob found her at the spring, the same spring she had shown him in the canyon, the water that had saved them all. The moon was full, the desert was silver, and she was standing at the edge of the pool, her feet bare, her hair loose, her face turned toward the sky. He came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, pulled her against his chest. She leaned into him, her hands covering his, and for a long time, neither spoke. "Do you remember?" she said finally. "The day I stepped off the train?" He pressed his lips to her hair, breathed her in. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen." She laughed, the same laugh that had made his chest ache the first time he heard it. "You thought I was a disaster." He turned her in his arms, looked down at her face, at the woman who had faced down outlaws and found water in the desert, and loved him even when he had not known how to love her back. "You were a disaster," he said. "You were also everything I never knew I needed." She reached up, touched his face, traced the lines that time had carved there. "I came here looking for a home," she said. "I found one." He kissed her then, there by the spring, under the moon, with the desert spread out around them like a sea of light. And when he pulled back, her eyes were bright. "We found it together," he said. "And in the cabin on the hill, the lights glowed warm and gold, and the children slept, and the horses rested, and the land that had been saved by a woman who was too wild to tame, and a man who had learned to love her, for it stretched out beneath the stars, peaceful and full. He had ordered a quiet frontier bride. He had gotten Eleanor Walsh instead, and he would not have changed a single thing.